7:55 in the morning, December 7th, 1941. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers swarm the skies over Oahu. In less than 2 hours, they destroy or damage 8 massive battleships. 2,400 Americans are dead. The Pacific Fleet lies in ruins, smoke rising from the harbor. In Tokyo, military leaders celebrate the reports. They believe they have neutralized the United States Navy and bought themselves the necessary time to seize Asia. The generals think the war is now winnable, but they overlooked a critical detail. 3 American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that morning. They were out at sea performing maneuvers. They were already hunting. The physical destruction was only one part of the equation. In Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle, the landscape is shifting. American factories are preparing to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Steel mills roar, assembly lines move. Women, immigrants, and retirees are heading to the factory floors. Over the next 4 years, these workers will build more aircraft than the Japanese Empire produced in its entire history. Japan's High Command believes the opening battle secured their victory. In reality, they had no idea what was coming. The scale of American industrial power was about to become a weapon. Why did Japan take this risk? They saw no other option. But was it a calculated move or a desperate mistake? Could Japan have actually won the Pacific War? Or did the first bomb dropped on Pearl Harbor seal their fate? The footage shows the magnitude of the fire. The sound of anti-aircraft guns is constant. But to understand the strategy behind the attack, one must look past the explosions. One must look at the economics. Events accelerated. To find out why Japan chose this path, the truth must be examined. It started with a lack of resources. It ended with total destruction. This was the beginning of the end. 1941. Japan had already spent 4 years fighting a brutal war of attrition in China. The conflict was a meat grinder. Casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. There was no end in sight. But Japan faced a more immediate threat. The nation was running dry. 80% of Japan's oil came from foreign imports. Most of that supply originated in the United States. In July 1941, the situation reached a breaking point. Japanese troops moved to occupy French Indochina. President Franklin Roosevelt responded immediately. He froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed suit. The result was a total oil embargo. Japan's military machine began to starve. The Imperial Japanese Navy looked at the numbers. They had enough fuel for 18 months of operations. After that, the tanks would be empty, massive warships would sit immobilized at the docks, the entire fleet would become useless scrap metal. The choice was stark. At first glance, a diplomatic solution was possible. But in reality, it meant total surrender of their ambitions. Japan could withdraw from China and negotiate with Washington. This meant accepting national humiliation. The military government would collapse under the weight of such a failure. Generals would lose their status. The empire would shrink. There was another option. They could go all in. The plan was simple. Seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. This would secure the resources needed to continue the war. It was a massive gamble, but the military leaders saw no other way to survive. But there was a problem. If Japan invaded the Dutch East Indies, the United States would intervene. The geographic reality was clear. American forces in the Philippines sat directly across Japan's planned supply lines. The U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was a constant shadow. American carriers could strike Japanese oil convoys at will. Japan could not secure the southern oil fields without neutralizing American power. The risk of an American flank attack was too high. The footage of the era shows the scale of the Japanese buildup, ships being fueled, Zero fighters being prepped on decks, the sound of heavy engines filling the air. Events accelerated. Diplomacy was dead. The Japanese High Command met in secret rooms to finalize the maps. They reached a conclusion. There was no turning back. They made the decision. Thus began the countdown to Pearl Harbor. December 1940. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood before Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. He did not offer empty promises of glory. Instead, he delivered a warning. Yamamoto was the commander of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew his enemy. If ordered to fight, I can guarantee a tough fight for 6 months. Those were his words. But he followed them with a cold reality. He had zero confidence in a war lasting 2 or 3 years. Yamamoto looked at the data. He understood the industrial math. The United States had twice the population of Japan. Its economy was 7 times larger. Most importantly, American steel mills produced 13 times more than Japan. Why go to war against such odds? Japanese military planners believed they saw a window of opportunity. The strategy was simple. Strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Cripple it for 12 months. Use that time to seize the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the Philippines. Capture Wake Island and Guam. The goal was a defensive ring across the Pacific. Japan would fortify every island. They would wait for the American counterattack. The Americans would face veteran sailors and massive supply lines. The cost in human life would be staggering. The sound of artillery and the sight of burning ships would break the American spirit. Japan didn't want to occupy Washington. They wanted a negotiation. They believed war-weary Americans would eventually quit. Japan would keep its new territories. The conflict would end on Tokyo's terms. It was a gamble based on a single idea. They assumed Americans lacked the will for a long, brutal conflict. At first glance, a logical military strategy. But in reality, a fatal miscalculation. The footage from the era shows the scale of the Japanese buildup. Thousands of sailors drilling, hundreds of planes prepared for takeoff. The planners were confident. They saw the Americans as soft and divided. Events accelerated. The plan was set in motion. There was no turning back. The assumption about American weakness was wrong. It was a catastrophic error. Yamamoto knew the industrial power of his rival. He knew the risk. But the decision had been made. The countdown to the strike had begun. Thus started the path to total destruction. December 7th, 1941, 6:20 in the morning, Hawaiian time. The first wave of Japanese aircraft takes off from 6 aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Oahu. 183 planes climb into the sky. Engines roar. The flight decks clear. 7:48 a.m. The attack begins. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers descend on Battleship Row. The sound of explosions fills the air. The USS Arizona takes a direct hit. A bomb penetrates the magazine and ignites over 1 million pounds of ammunition. The ship vanishes in a massive fireball. In the frame, a tower of black smoke. 1,177 crew members die in minutes. The USS Oklahoma is next. 9 torpedoes tear into its hull. The ship rolls over in the water, capsizing and trapping 429 men inside the steel hull. Screams are heard from within the wreckage. Within 2 hours, the damage is tallied. 8 battleships are sunk or heavily damaged. 188 American aircraft are smoking ruins on the runways. 2,403 Americans are dead. Japan's losses are minimal. 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 130 men. In Tokyo, officials celebrate. At first glance, a stunning success. The United States battleship fleet is crippled. Japan's southern offensive can now proceed without opposition. But there were problems. The 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not at Pearl Harbor. The Enterprise was delayed by a storm. The Lexington was delivering planes to Midway. The Saratoga was docked in San Diego. All 3 survived. There was another mistake. The Japanese bombers ignored the infrastructure. Millions of gallons of oil sit untouched in massive fuel storage tanks. The repair docks are undamaged. These facilities will eventually raise and rebuild the sunken ships. The submarine base remains fully operational. These subs will soon launch the most devastating undersea campaign in history. Japan sank the steel, but they left the tools to forge it back together. Events accelerated. American public opinion had been divided about the war. That division vanished. The nation unified instantly. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress. He asked for a formal declaration of war. The Senate voted 82-0. The House of Representatives voted 388-1. The lone dissenter was Jeannette Rankin of Montana. She was the first woman ever elected to Congress. She had also voted against entering World War I. She followed her conscience, but she stood alone. America was not going to negotiate. America was going to fight. That changed everything. Thus began the total mobilization of a superpower. 1941. This was the year the Japanese leadership made a fatal calculation. They understood the quality of their weapons. They knew their pilots were elite. But they ignored the industrial reality. The Mitsubishi Zero fighter dominated the skies. It was faster and more maneuverable than any American plane in the Pacific. Japanese naval doctrine was precise, but tactics do not win modern wars. Factories do. How massive was the gap? The answer lies in the production logs. Consider the statistics of steel. Steel builds the hulls of carriers. It forms the barrels of artillery. It creates the shells that destroy cities. American mills produced 75 million tons of steel every year. Japan produced 7 million tons. The ratio was 13-1. In one single month, American workers processed more steel than Japan could manage in an entire year. The footage shows massive industrial chimneys in Pittsburgh and Detroit never stopped smoking. The sound of heavy machinery was constant, but it got worse. Oil was the next factor. The United States pumped over 1 billion barrels of crude oil annually. The rigs in Texas, California, and Oklahoma operated around the clock. The supply was internal and infinite. Japan had almost no domestic oil. Every drop was imported. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese seized oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. It was a strategic move, but it failed. At first glance, Japan had secured its fuel, but in reality, they had nothing. Allied engineers sabotaged the wells before the retreat. They blew up the pumps and set the storage tanks on fire. The smoke could be seen for miles. It took months for Japanese technicians to repair the damage. Even when the oil finally flowed, Japan faced a new obstacle. They lacked the tankers to move the fuel across the ocean. American submarines moved into position. They patrolled the shipping lanes and waited. The camera records, a Japanese tanker sinking beneath the waves. There was no way to replace the lost tonnage. Events accelerated. Without steel, Japan could not replace its ships. Without oil, its planes could not fly. The war was decided on the assembly line. The numbers were final. 132 million citizens lived in the United States. Japan had 73 million. This meant America possessed nearly twice the population and twice the workforce. It meant twice the number of potential soldiers and an economy 5 times larger. How did this translate to the battlefield? The answer is industrial output. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 354,000 aircraft. This included fighters, heavy bombers, torpedo planes, and reconnaissance aircraft. In that same period, Japan built 76,000. The gap was massive. In 1944 alone, the United States reached peak production. They built 96,000 aircraft in a single year. This single-year total exceeded Japan's entire production for the whole war. Japan's best year resulted in 28,000 aircraft. The United States was manufacturing planes 3 times faster every single year. It got worse. The gap in shipbuilding was even more extreme. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States launched 147 aircraft carriers. This total included massive fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan built 18. The footage from the shipyards tells the story. In 1943, Japan had 3 aircraft carriers under construction. At that exact moment, American shipyards had 22 Essex-class fleet carriers on the slips. Thousands of workers swarmed the steel hulls. The sound of riveting was constant. Could Japan bridge the gap? No. In the 3 years following the Battle of Midway, Japan completed 6 carriers. In that same window, the United States launched 27 fleet carriers and 77 escort carriers. The American industrial machine did not just win, it overwhelmed the enemy. The war ended in the factories first. 2,700 Liberty ships. This was the number of cargo vessels America built during the war. It didn't stop there. Transport ships, supply vessels, and tankers flooded the oceans. The math was relentless. 3 new ships launched every 2 days. This pace continued for 4 years without a break. Japan could not match this output. The industrial gap was too wide. This was not a fair contest. It was a mismatch of historic proportions. Japan's strategy rested on a single assumption. They believed Americans would see the rising cost of war and quit. They expected the public to get tired of the casualties. This logic wasn't entirely irrational. It was based on a specific historical precedent. 1904. Japan fought the Russian Empire. Russia was larger and had more people. They possessed more raw resources, but the Japanese military won a decisive victory. At the Battle of Tsushima, they destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet. Russia negotiated for peace immediately. The war was expensive, and the Russian population was exhausted. Tsar Nicholas II accepted a settlement. Japan believed the same logic would apply to the United States, but this was a catastrophic misreading of American political culture. At first glance, a soft democracy, but in reality, a mobilized industrial machine. The United States in 1941 was not Tsarist Russia. The camera records the scene at recruitment offices, lines of men stretching around city blocks. Pearl Harbor didn't break American morale. It unified the country. There was no room for negotiation. There was no turning back. December 7, 1941. Tokyo miscalculated the American reaction. The Imperial Command did not view the strike as a mere tactical shift. They saw it as a strategic necessity. But in Washington, the perspective was different. It was a betrayal. Japanese diplomats were still in meetings while the bombs fell. The American public stopped talking about peace. They demanded revenge. How did Japan plan to win? They counted on a short conflict, but the United States possessed a massive industrial base. Factories began converting to war production overnight. Steel mills and shipyards started working 24 hours a day. But there was a second problem Japan failed to predict. The Pacific was not an isolated theater. To the west, Germany was locked in a massive struggle with the Soviet Union. If Moscow fell, Germany would control the European continent. This was Japan's only hope for a balanced world power. Without a German victory, Japan would face the British Empire and the United States alone. Then, the situation changed. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. Italy followed. Now, America was engaged in a global struggle on 2 fronts. Did this stretch American resources too thin? At first glance, yes, but in reality, no. The United States had the raw materials and manpower to fuel 2 separate wars. American generals made a cold calculation. The policy was Germany first. They would crush the Third Reich while fighting a holding action in the Pacific. Japan was now facing only a fraction of American military might. Even so, the tide began to turn. Events accelerated. June 1942. 6 months had passed since the flames at Pearl Harbor. On paper, the Japanese Empire looked invincible. The Philippines had surrendered. Malaya and Singapore were gone. The Dutch East Indies were under Japanese control. The map showed a vast new empire stretching across the ocean. But one threat remained. The American aircraft carriers were still operational. They were ghosts in the Pacific, striking and disappearing. Admiral Yamamoto needed to draw them into a final battle. The target was Midway Island. It sat 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. The Japanese fleet moved out. The objective was simple: lure the Americans into a trap and destroy their remaining naval power. The footage from the era shows the scale of the mobilization. Carriers, battleships, and cruisers stretched to the horizon. There was no room for error. But the Americans had one advantage the Japanese didn't know about. They had broken the naval codes. They were waiting. The trap was set, but not by Japan. June 4th, 1942. The objective was simple: lure the United States Navy into a final trap and sink their carriers. Admiral Yamamoto commanded the largest fleet in Japanese history, 4 heavy aircraft carriers, hundreds of specialized planes, dozens of battleships and cruisers. It was a massive steel wall moving across the Pacific. The Americans had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. But Yorktown was a ghost. 1 month earlier, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, she was crippled. Experts estimated months for repairs. The Navy Yard worked 72 hours straight. They patched the hull and sent her back to sea. But the real weapon wasn't steel. It was intelligence. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese radio signals and cracked the cipher. They knew the date. They knew the location. They knew the target was Midway Atoll. The trap was set, but not by Japan. The footage from the era shows the moment of contact. At 10:24 in the morning, American dive bombers dropped from the clouds. They caught 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, at their most vulnerable. Their flight decks were packed with torpedoes, bombs, and fuel hoses. 5 minutes, that is all it took. The sound of secondary explosions ripped through the hulls. Within 300 seconds, 3 symbols of Japanese imperial power were burning wrecks. Later that afternoon, a 4th carrier, Hiryu, followed them to the bottom. The losses were absolute. 4 fleet carriers vanished in a single day. 3,000 men died. More importantly, 200 of the most elite pilots in the world were gone. The Americans lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and a single destroyer. Events accelerated. Japan never recovered from the blow. These carriers were more than just floating runways. They were the heart of Japan's naval aviation. They carried the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the mechanics who knew every bolt, the pilots who had spent years in the cockpit. The math of war changed. A shipyard can launch a new hull in 12 months. It takes years to produce a combat-ready pilot. This was the moment the production gap became a death sentence. Japan could replace the steel. They could never replace the men. The tide of the Pacific War turned in 5 minutes, thus ended the era of Japanese expansion. 1941. At the start of the Pacific War, Japanese naval pilots entered the cockpit with an average of 700 flight hours. They were the elite of the skies. American pilots began the conflict with only 150 hours of training. Japan held every advantage: better pilots, superior aircraft, and refined combat tactics. But the momentum shifted. By mid-1944, the situation had reversed completely. New Japanese pilot recruits were graduating with only 40 hours of total flight time. 40 hours. This was barely enough time to learn how to take off and land a plane on a carrier deck without crashing. Meanwhile, the average American pilot by mid-1944 arrived in theater with at least 525 hours of training. Why did the gap widen? Japan could not replace its veteran losses. The empire viewed pilots as disposable warriors. America took a different path. They rotated veterans back home to train the next generation. The U.S. was producing skilled aviators faster than the enemy could kill them. June 1944, the Philippine Sea. The American counteroffensive moved across the Pacific at high speed. U.S. forces targeted the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These were vital air bases. Japan responded with everything they had left. They launched a massive carrier strike. The fleet consisted of 9 carriers and over 400 aircraft. On the radar screens, the American fleet saw them coming. U.S. pilots climbed into the cockpits of the new F-6F Hellcat. These machines were fast, armored, and deadly. The Hellcats tore through the Japanese formations. The sky was filled with falling debris and burning oil. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In just 2 days, Japan lost over 600 aircraft. The scale of the disaster was absolute. 600 planes was more than Japan could build in an entire year at peak production. American losses totaled 123 aircraft. Most of those pilots were rescued from the water. By this point, the U.S. Navy operated 18 fleet and light carriers in the Pacific. Japan had 9. But the numbers alone do not reveal the true disparity. The footage shows the reality. American carriers were bristling with radar antennas and heavy anti-aircraft batteries. American pilots possessed hundreds of hours of combat preparation. New aircraft arrived at the front lines daily. Japan's carriers were operated by panicked teenagers flying obsolete Zeros. They had no reinforcements. The battle ended. The Japanese naval air arm was effectively destroyed. The era of Japanese carrier dominance was over. 7 losses in 8 months. That was the total count for U.S. Navy dive bombers and torpedo planes in aerial combat during the final phase of the Pacific War. On paper, the Imperial Japanese Navy still existed. In reality, it was a ghost fleet. The ships were either at the bottom of the ocean or trapped in harbors without fuel. Why did Japan think they could win? They banked on a single outcome, the United States losing its will to fight. But Washington does not walk away from wars of total commitment. This was especially true after a surprise attack that killed thousands of American citizens. The emotional and political stakes were too high for a negotiated peace. Tactics could not save Tokyo. Even if every Japanese commander had made perfect decisions, the result remained the same. Even if the Battle of Midway had ended in a Japanese victory. Even if their pilots had maintained superior training throughout the conflict. None of it would have mattered in the end. And wars of attrition are simple math. The side that replaces its losses faster wins. Japan could not do that. Imagine Japan wins at Midway. 3 American aircraft carriers sink to the bottom. Thousands of U.S. sailors die in the wreckage. What is the result? American shipyards simply ramp up production. Training schools churn out thousands of fresh pilots. The counteroffensive does not stop. It remains relentless because the industrial base in the United States is physically untouchable by Japanese bombers. The footage from 1943 shows a country at its limit. Japan's economy was running at maximum capacity. Factories operated 24 hours a day. Civilian goods vanished from store shelves. Every scrap of metal and drop of oil went to the military. It was still not enough to match the enemy. The United States was fighting a 2-ocean war simultaneously. Washington sent massive convoys of supplies to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. They equipped millions of soldiers across 2 hemispheres. They built thousands of ships and tens of thousands of aircraft. American production did not just continue, it expanded. By 1945, more than 50% of all industrial production on the entire planet took place inside the United States. Admiral Yamamoto understood this reality before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. His warning to the Japanese government was not a guess, it was a prophecy. He told them he could run wild for 6 months to a year. After that, he had no illusions about what would follow. The industrial clock was ticking. Thus ended the hope of a Japanese victory. June 4th, 1942. The Battle of Midway began. This was exactly 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto did not join the celebrations after the initial raid. Records show he spent the day after Pearl Harbor in a deep depression. He stayed in his cabin. He refused to speak. Yamamoto understood the reality. He knew he had guaranteed the ultimate defeat of the Japanese Empire. Why did Japan attack despite the warnings? The alternative was impossible for the leadership. They had to withdraw from China. They had to accept the total oil embargo. The military government would lose face and power. This was a political dead end. Instead, Tokyo made a bet. They gambled that American war weariness would lead to a negotiated peace. They hoped the United States would simply give up. It was the wrong calculation. This failure did not happen because American soldiers were braver. It was not because American generals possessed superior intelligence. The reason was industrial. American factories replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The sound of assembly lines drowned out the sound of gunfire. Wars of attrition are won by the side with the highest replacement rate. In 1941, that side was the United States. The gap was massive. Japan's leadership knew the mathematics of the situation. Yamamoto explicitly warned the High Command. The oil embargo gave the Imperial Navy exactly 18 months of fuel. After that, the fleet would stop moving. The footage from the era is clear. Massive steel plants in Pittsburgh and Detroit worked 24 hours a day. In the frame, thousands of aircraft fuselages line the factory floors. In Japan, resources were already drying up. Was Pearl Harbor a rational calculation? Was it a desperate gamble? Or was it simply strategic suicide? At first glance, a calculated strike, but in reality, a death sentence. History shows what happens when nations make decisions based on hope instead of math. Ideology clashed with industrial reality. Leaders chose a war they knew they would likely lose. Japan tried to win an economic conflict against an adversary that could build 10 tanks for everyone Japan produced. It was never a contest. The numbers tell the story. The results were final. The story ends with the total collapse of the Japanese war machine. It was inevitable. The factories won the war before the peace treaties were signed. Thus ended the gamble.